If you have ever struggled with pouring alternative milks, ending up with something that looks a little bit more like a watery blob than it does a tulip, then have no fear, because today we are going to talk about how to pour and steam alternative milks that both look great but also taste delicious. Now, most of you know that I am a proficient alternative milk drinker, having lost the physical ability to drink milk about 5 or 6 years ago. Since then, oat milk has been my go-to, and I have steamed a lot of it. So today, we're going to talk about my top tips and tricks in order to steam and pour delicious oat milk. And in the spirit of Jenny Nicholson, instead of just giving you word vomit, I have organized today's video in an internet-friendly numbered list. So, without further ado, let's begin. We begin in the only place where we can begin, with tip number 1, which is choose the right type of milk. Now, everything we're going to be talking today is going to apply to the full range of alternative milks, whether you are drinking almond milk or oat milk or soy milk. But before we get to that, we have to talk a little bit about dairy milk. Now, the standard dairy milk that is served with specialty coffee is going to be whole milk. This has about a 3.25 to 3.5% fat content. Whole dairy milk lives in this perfect sweet spot where it both pairs really nicely with coffee in terms of taste, not necessarily overshadowing it, but having a complementary sweetness. But additionally, whole milk has a really nice composition of proteins and fats that allow it to steam well. This gives us that smooth, buttery microfoam that allows us to both pour latte art and also experience a nice, creamy texture. Now, most alternative milks, especially homemade ones, will have a much higher percentage of water in them, and they'll be lacking in that fat and protein composition in order to create that kind of whole milk-like texture. And this is why it's super important to buy coffee-focused or barista series alternative milks. I happen to have a few right here. Now, I want to give a huge thank you to Pacific Barista Series for sponsoring today's video. We are going to be using their alternative milks for all of our demonstrations today. And this is a really, really great example of alternative milks that are specifically built for coffee, not only as something that will steam and pour very similarly to whole milk, but also to taste really good with coffee. I'm of the belief that milk, no matter if it's dairy or an alternative milk, should never overshadow a coffee. The two should be a pairing. They need to work together to become greater than the sum of their parts. I'm primarily going to be working with oat milk today. However, again, as I mentioned before, what we're going to be talking about applies to pretty much any alternative milk, no matter what the base ingredient is. Okay, back to why it's important to choose a coffee-focused and barista series alternative milk versus one that is maybe made for just more general home use, be it baking or cereal or what have you. If you look at the nutrition facts on the side of a barista series versus one of these others, you'll notice that there is a higher fat content. And this is specifically because these are built to pair with coffee in similar ways, both in flavor but also mechanically to how whole milk does. This is going to be a very important contributing factor to give us that really nice microfoam and buttery smooth texture in our final latte. Moving on to tip number 2, which I am going to lovingly call chill and shake. Now, while a majority of alternative milk cartons are shelf stable prior to being opened, you want to make sure that before you use your milk for the first time, it is refrigerated and cool. Additionally, every single time you get out your milk, you want to make sure you give it a nice, thorough shake. Unlike dairy milk, which is pretty dang homogeneous all the time, alternative milks have a tendency to separate slightly more, and so to give us the best chance of success, we want to make sure everything is all mixed up. Okay, those are all of our prep tips. Let me grab some pictures. Okay, so I'm going to be using 2 pitchers today. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. You can use 1 pitcher if you want. I'll kind of explain the differences in technique depending on which you go with, but I'm using 2 today. One of them is going to be for steaming and the other one is going to be for pouring. We're going to be filling our pitcher to just kind of under the spout. This is going to leave us plenty of room left in the pitcher for when our milk expands with the addition of air. Now, in case you aren't familiar with the process of milk steaming, I'll go over it really quickly. Milk steaming happens in 2 phases. You have your first phase, which is aeration, essentially introducing air and steam and heat into our milk to make it nice and fluffy. And the second phase is incorporation of that air into the rest of your milk, leaving you with a nice, consistent, homogeneous texture. The aeration phase at the front is going to be the shortest of the 2 sections, whereas a majority of your time steaming is going to be incorporating all of that air. But this brings us to tip Number 3, I think we're on 3. With alternative milk, you want to make sure you are introducing air in very, very short spurts. You never want to be introducing a large amount of air, and you especially want to make sure you don't introduce too much air at the beginning. To do this, you want to make sure you start with the tip of your steam wand fully submerged in the milk. This allows you to control when you bring it to the top and when you start introducing air. You'll want to hear a very quick and sharp tearing sound, even quicker than when you're steaming dairy milk. Additionally, I always add slightly more air to my alternative milks than I do dairy milk. Alternative milks in general take a little bit more time and kind of air structure to develop for pouring than their dairy counterparts. In general though, even though you want to add a little bit more air by incorporating more short spurts, you don't want to be incorporating for more than like 4 to 6 seconds. There might be a second or two variants on either end, depending on if you're steaming less milk or more milk. There's no one number that fits all pitchers. After that, it is vital that we sink the tip of our steam wand down to about halfway down the pitcher and look to be creating a whirlpool in our milk. Ideally, you'll see any large bubbles that happen to be sitting on the top of the milk be pulled down into the rest of the pitcher. And this brings us to tip number 4, which is always check your temperature. Dairy milk begins to denature around 160 degrees Fahrenheit. This means that sweetness starts to leave really, really quickly, and you might even reach a point where it starts to taste bitter. Now this happens at a little bit lower temperature in most alternative milks. I typically see it happen around 150 to 155 degrees Fahrenheit. Similarly, your milk will begin to taste a lot less sweet, and you might even start to see separation in the texture that's going to make it really, really hard to pour with later. So to counteract this, I pay extra close attention to the temperature of my alternative milk. I like to take this to 135 to 145 degrees max. Not only is that a really nice ready to drink temperature, but you're going to experience the maximum sweetness and texture out of it. You can check this with a temperature probe or some type of thermometer until you get the feel of what that temperature is like against your hand while you're steaming. All right, we have now steamed our milk, which brings us to tip number 5. Counterintuitively, let your milk sit for a little bit. This is something that you pretty rarely hear when talking about steaming milk. Usually my instruction to you is going to be pour immediately so that foam doesn't set up too much. However, with alternative milks, it's nice to give your milk just 10 to 15 seconds of no movement after steaming in order to create a slightly sturdier foam. We aren't looking to let it fully separate and sit on the top, but we do want it to form up and tighten a little bit more. So simply 10 to 15 seconds, let your pitcher rest for a moment. Now, this is where we're going to diverge slightly. If you are only using one pitcher, you can skip ahead to the next step. However, if you are using 2 pitchers, we're going to move on to tip like 5.5, I think I will call it. Tip 5.5 is pitcher transfer after your milk has rested. So we're done steaming. We have given it 10 to 15 seconds. So now we have a slightly sturdier foam. However, there has been some separation that happens. As you let your milk sit, a majority of the foam is going to rise to the top, whereas the bottom is going to be mostly liquid. Now, we want that to happen a tiny bit, but we also still want to have a homogeneous texture to pour with. So to make that all incorporated once more, we're simply going to transfer pitchers. This is not to really agitate the milk. You can just kind of pour it slowly and easily down the side of your other pitcher. Okay, we are rejoining the 1 pitcher people, and we are moving on to tip number 6, which is to polish your milk. Now, this is something I do after I have pitcher transferred, or you can do this after you let your milk rest for 10 to 15 seconds via the last step. What this is going to do is pop and incorporate any final air bubbles that may not have been brought into the entirety of the milk or may have been caused by pitcher transferring. To do this, simply grab your pitcher. You can hang on to the top or you can grab it by the handle. You're going to tap or bang it against a hard surface 1 or 2 times just to pop any final bubbles you see, and then simply give it a swirl. This is a quick process. You only really need to swirl it 2 or 3 times, give it 2 or 3 taps, and then you're ready to go. Oh my gosh, we are finally pouring. This is so exciting. But before we do that, we have one last tip with tip number 7. I'm looking at my notes. My notes say 6. So maybe it's 6. It feels like 7. You'll let me know, or I'll find out in the edit. The very last tip I have for you for pouring beautiful latte art with alternative milk is lean into the blob. I like to take a slightly different approach to pouring latte art with alternative milk than I do dairy. This is specifically around the design of tulips, which is one of the most common latte art designs. With dairy milk, it's super easy to achieve a ton of wiggles. You get all those nice lines through your base. However, that can be a lot harder to achieve with something like oat milk or almond milk. My recommendation is maybe don't try to achieve that. Maybe there is a design that works even better with these types of milks. My favorite way to pour alternative milks, and the way that I think often looks the best the most frequently, is pouring stacked tulips. Now, stacked tulips are exactly what they sound like. They are tulips made out of a ton of tiny stacks. And essentially, all you're doing is pouring blobs into one another, which blobs are the easiest thing to make with alternative milk, and we're just turning them into something even prettier. To pour a stacked tulip, you're going to begin by pouring a small circular base, and then you're simply going to set further circular bases into them, working your way back until you're finally ready to pour a heart and to pull through. You're not doing any wiggles with your wrist, you're not doing any of that. You are keeping it simple and consistent, and it yields something that is super, super beautiful, even with milks that are hard to pour with. Now, if you have followed all of these steps, hopefully you have ended up with something that looks pretty nice, but we always have to remember the most important thing is that it tastes pretty nice as well. And indeed it does. Now, I really, really love pouring with alternative milks. I think they're super fun, and I think their flavor profiles can add so much to coffee. So this was a really fun video to do, and I hope this was somewhat helpful to you. Again, a huge thank you to Pacific Barista Series for sponsoring today's video. They have been the alternative milks I have been using since the very, very beginning of my very first barista shift. So this is a very, very fun full circle. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to respond to as much as possible. But in the meantime, I'll see y'all next time. Goodbye, everyone.